Welcome back and thank you for keeping it NTV. You are still watching NTV Weekend Edition. Tonight on Talk of the Nation, we look at the impact of the latest raft of sanctions imposed by the UK and US over corruption allegations. And the backdrop of this, on Tuesday, the UK government imposed sanctions on the Speaker Anita Among, as well as former Karamoja Affairs Ministers, that is Agnes Nandutu and Mary Goretti Kitutu, over the involvement in the Karamoja iron sheet scandal. Now later, the US added to the list the State Minister Amos Lugolobi and former Deputy Chief of Defense Forces, that is Lieutenant General Peter Elwelu. But there are concerns that the actual impact of these sanctions extend beyond the individuals involved to the country's economy. And to help us appreciate this, the actual impact of these sanctions, we turn to JOHN WALUGEMBE, the Executive Director of the Federation of the Small and Medium Enterprises. Good evening, sir, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Mildred, and thank you for having me this evening, as always.
All right. So, Mr. JOHN WALUGEMBE would like to first of all understand what these sanctions mean for the benefit of our viewer. Okay, so first of all, these are unilateral sanctions, and they are targeted sanctions. You know, previously, sanctions are used by countries to protect their national security and to discourage certain behavior in relation to other nations and individuals. Previously, you used to have blanket sanctions. These would be asset freezes, there would be embargoes and so on, and initially on governments and nations. But this has now turned towards targeted sanctions. Like what we are? Exactly. The blanket sanctions, people complained, would hurt poor people. If you look at Zimbabwe, what the sanctions did there, if you look at Iraq, if you look at Syria. So the argument has been, if you sanction a nation, it's the poorest that you hurt. If you look at Venezuela and so on. Yes. So what these countries have now started doing is to target particular individuals who they think are responsible for particular actions. And for the US and the UK, in this instance, they've talked about corruption, they've talked about human rights and things like that. Yes. I'm not a fan of these kinds of targeted sanctions because evidence proves that they don't really lead to change in behavior. So at the end of the day, you don't get the desired result. But they can be a deterrent. So other people who might want to follow suit might think twice before engaging in those kinds of things. Okay, so there are concerns that these sanctions just stretch beyond, fighting corruption and could actually trickle down, the effect could trickle down to the economy. Do you? Definitely, because on one hand you're talking about human rights and corruption, but you're basically taking economic, these are pretty much economic sanctions against those individuals, because you're talking about asset freezes, you're talking about travel bans, you're talking about restrictions on financial transactions, so it means that you're hitting them in the pocket, you know. So ultimately, these sanctions have been proven, these kinds of targeted sanctions, hurt the individual financially in the short term. I've told you they don't lead to change in behavior. There's no evidence that they lead to change in behavior, but they have a serious negative financial impact on the individual. But also long term, they have negative impact on not just the value chain in which they operate, but also the economy of the country as a whole. And I'll give you an illustration. Yes. So if I'm sanctioned, it means the banks, my bankers have to be concerned about sanctions compliance, because if they're not compliant with sanctions, it means the US and the UK might also sanction them. So it means now all of a sudden financial institutions are paying more money to ensure that they are compliant with sanctions. And if you have more and more individuals getting sanctioned, it means the cost of compliance for those financial institutions increases if they have to continue operating in that market. So what you'll see is certain financial institutions that are operational in the West will choose to close because they feel it's not worth it. We are spending so much on navigating this sanctions regime, and we are better off exiting. Similarly, other actors who deal with you, either directly or indirectly, might end up also getting sanctioned. But also these individuals, and these are not these are powerful individuals. They've invested in the economy, they support MSMEs and so on. So all these will be affected. We can't just look at them as individuals and celebrate. We need to look at the impact at the wider level. And I'll give an illustration of Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, they had those blanket sanctions, but they also had those individualized sanctions. But what was found is that even when the blanket sanctions were removed, the impact on the economy, negative impact on the economy continued because of those spillover effects that I've just mentioned.
Yes.
So in the end, what you see is that most of those have been removed and they've just remained with a few people on the sanctions list.
Yes.
So I would say that even here, we have to be careful. Okay. If more and more Ugandans are getting sanctioned, it means that we shall become a high-risk country. Okay. So for those celebrating this, we have to think twice about this. And as I said, on one hand, those sanctions are good because it makes people think twice before engaging in certain actions. But on the other hand, they are negative because they can have those spillover effects beyond the individuals.
Beyond the individuals. Yes. Well, you did mention that this could have an effect on the financial institutions.
Yes.
And are there any other sectors that are going to be affected, especially when it comes to the business? Because also would like, for the benefit of the viewer, to interrogate and to understand how a sanction on a particular individual can trickle down to, say, a business owner, a small business owner.
Yeah, because for instance, if you look at tourism, for instance, because you're talking about travel bans, again, it's going to have the same impact on airlines, on travel agencies, and so on. In the sense that if they're not careful and they book a sanctioned individual, it means they may find themselves in a tough spot with some of these countries. So it means that if I'm a travel agent, I have to think twice and have a list to see, is this person sanctioned or not? You see, otherwise I may find myself in trouble. So but also the general perception, because very many things in life are about perception. If investors are thinking of Uganda and you find that very many Ugandans are on the sanctions list, they may choose to say, you know what, it's a high-risk country. If tourists are determining where should I go and they find that in Uganda we have 200 individuals sanctioned, they may like, you know what, this may cause me problems. I may go in there, make a deal, and then I find that the company I'm dealing with is owned partially or indirectly by a sanctioned individual, and then I'm in trouble. So it's this walking on eggshells that is likely to cause this economy to suffer.
Okay, so is it possible for the government to take action to, lighten these sanctions?
How? I think the government needs to look at the reasons why and to ensure that those are handled. Of course, the US and the UK talk about human rights, and in certain aspects they might be correct, but also in certain other aspects they may also be using this sanctions regime to try to influence affairs on the ground for their geopolitical interests. So it means government needs to sit down and see, are these genuine issues? If they're genuine issues, then they are better addressed. The government is better off addressing them. If they're ungenuine, then how do you handle them politically in a way that does not hurt your economy? So
now, with Uganda slowly looking to expand our footprint in substantial areas, for example, petroleum, energy, that will expose us to more international economies. How do we avoid such sanctions to see to it that some of these sectors actually flourish?
No, so I think that we must have a unit that studies these things and the trends, and to ensure that we avoid falling prey. Uganda, for instance, was on the green list, and then it was recently removed because of money laundering and things like that. So we must have a unit that looks at these things to ensure that we lower our risk, not just for government as a whole, but also for individuals within government. So it means they can advise that some of the things that you're engaging in will lead you to being sanctioned. Please try to moderate A, try to moderate B, and so on. It's better we take a preventive kind of approach than a reactive approach, because what I've seen is being dismissive. Oh, those guys, oh this, oh that, oh that. At the end of the day, all of us, when these sanctions start to bite, we'll all be in the same boat. So I think for me, this is something we need to look at very carefully. And if they keep raising the issue of human rights and so on, maybe it's something we need to look at more seriously.
And we did talk about how this is going to affect the businesses as we wrap up this conversation.
Yes.
What are some of those measures that different businesses that could be affected by these sanctions could take to see that the impact is not so heavy on them? So
businesses, for instance, in the financial services sector, need to I think the risk management unit needs to look at this very carefully. Businesses in travel, I think, also need to look at that carefully. And also businesses, I mean, if stock exchange or whatever, these are all things to look at. You know, this company, if this company is trying to merge with the other, you know, who owns the company at the end of the day. And now we have thankfully URSB has what they call the beneficial ownership kind of regime that helps to know who is the ultimate owner of this business. So for me, I would say, let's be proactive. Yes, we have those internal contradictions, you know, the Mabati and stuff like that, but also why should we rely on outsiders to resolve them? You know, if we can solve them internally without having outsiders determining who is guilty or not, I think that would be the best course of action.
Okay, yeah. So what would be your closing remarks in this regard?
My closing remarks is that it's unfortunate that these individuals have been sanctioned. It's an unpleasant situation, as I've told you. They'll go through intense financial difficulty if they have to travel, if they have to transact. If they had assets outside the country, they would be frozen. They'll lose those assets. So the pain will start from the individual. There'll definitely be some spillovers in the economy. The extent is unknown because this is an area that has not been studied much, but what we know is that there will be some spillover effects on the economy.
Thank you so much, JOHN WALUGEMBE. He is the Executive Director of the Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, getting to share with us the broader picture of the sanctions when it comes to the economy. An argument that these could actually have a greater impact on the economy, and his advice is for us to watch out and of course be vigilant. And with that we take a break, but NTV we can